She could hear them laughing at her from across the room. Not trying to hide it. Not even pretending. Just leaning into each other and laughing, their voices carrying over the soft restaurant music, over the clinking of crystal glasses, over the careful, practiced sounds of a place where money and elegance were the only currencies that mattered. Ada kept her head down and her grip tight on the serving tray, willing her hands not to shake and the glasses on it not to betray her. Did you see what she's wearing? Some people just don't know their place. She looks like she walked out of a village market. Every single word. She heard every single word. It was supposed to be a normal evening shift at the upscale restaurant where she worked, the kind of place where wealthy people came to be seen, and people like Ada were supposed to be invisible. Mostly she managed it. Mostly she moved through those rooms like furniture, present and functional and unremarkable. Tonight was different. Tonight she had become the entertainment. And what happened in that room over the next 20 minutes would change everything, for Ada, for every person sitting at that table, and for the entire restaurant, in ways none of them could have predicted. Ada had worked at Meridian for 3 years. She knew the rhythms of the place the way you know a difficult relationship, every corner and every cruelty, every unspoken rule and every moment when dignity had to be swallowed quietly and quickly before anyone noticed it was there. She moved through the dining room with efficiency and care, memorizing orders without writing them down, anticipating requests before they were made, learning which tables needed warmth and which ones needed to be served and left alone. She was good at her job. Genuinely good. But in a restaurant like Meridian, being good at your job was table stakes. What really determined your standing was something Ada could not purchase and had not been born into, the particular ease that comes from never having worried about money, the fluency in luxury that passes between certain people like a private language, the casual certainty that the world was arranged for your comfort. Ada had none of that. She had rough hands from years of work. She had a uniform that was clean and pressed but faded at the collar, shoes that were polished but cracked at the seams. She had a practiced smile she deployed like a shield. And she had Chinidu in the kitchen, who was the closest thing she had to a friend in that building, and who noticed when she came through those kitchen doors looking like she'd taken another hit. That evening, Table 4 was the kind of table Ada had learned to approach carefully. 6 guests. All dressed in the particular way of people who spend money loudly, the jewelry too conspicuous, the laughter too performative, the confidence of people who expected to be served and who considered the people serving them a backdrop to their evening rather than participants in it. At the center of it sat a woman in a sparkling red gown, her hair swept up, her posture the posture of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room she entered. Ada approached with the first round of drinks. Placed them carefully, moved efficiently, said what needed to be said and nothing more. "Excuse me." The voice was sharp. Ada turned. The woman in red was looking at her, not at her face, but at her. At the uniform, at the shoes, at the whole composition of her, the way you look at something you're evaluating for a purpose it may not be suited to. "Are you the one serving this table?" "Yes, ma'am." The woman leaned back in her chair. "Then explain to me why someone like you is working here." The table laughed. Not politely, fully, openly, the way people laugh when they've been given permission to say the quiet part out loud. Ada felt her chest compress. "I'm just doing my job, ma'am." "Your job." The woman's tone was its own kind of contempt. "This is a luxury restaurant. People come here for class. For standard. Not." She paused, letting the pause carry what she wanted to say, "whatever this is." More laughter. Louder. "I'm sorry if there's any inconvenience," Ada said. Her voice was soft and steady and gave away nothing. "Just don't come too close to the food," the woman said. "You might contaminate it." The laughter this time was the loudest yet. Ada nodded, forced the small professional smile she had trained herself to maintain, and turned to leave. But before she could take a full step, "Wait." A man at the table. Older, studying her. "There's something familiar about you." Ada's heart skipped once, involuntarily. She kept her face still. "I don't think so, sir." He shrugged. "Maybe not. You just look like someone who shouldn't be here." Laughter again, and Ada walked away. In the kitchen she put the tray down and leaned against the wall and let herself exhale, just once, Completely. Chinidu appeared beside her almost immediately. "They're giving you trouble again." "It's nothing," she said. "You say that every time." She didn't answer. Because what was there to say? That she was tired? That she was learning to be tired quietly, in the back of her throat, in the space between one table and the next, so that by the time she walked back out into that dining room she could carry it invisibly? That every insult landed differently at the end of a long shift when your feet ached and you'd been awake since 5 and you couldn't afford to react because reacting meant risking the job, and the job was the only thing standing between you and a worse version of tonight? There was no space for any of that. There never was. "Table 6 needs their order," the manager called. Ada straightened, wiped her hands on her apron, picked up a fresh tray, and walked back out. She was halfway across the dining room when she noticed that something in the atmosphere had shifted. The laughter at table 4 had quieted. The usual ambient hum of conversation had dropped. People were turning their heads toward the entrance, slowly, the way a crowd turns when something genuinely worth watching has arrived. Ada slowed her steps slightly. Frowned. What was happening? She set the tray at table 6 and turned to look. A man had just walked in. He wore a simple black suit, cut perfectly, and nothing else that announced itself. No loud watch, no conspicuous accessories, nothing that said "look at me" the way the people in this room usually said it. But the moment he stepped through the door, the room changed. Conversations stopped. People sat a little straighter. Even the staff, Ada could see it from where she stood, adjusted themselves without realizing they were doing it. There was something about the quality of his stillness. The way he moved, unhurried, completely certain, as if the room's response to his presence was something he had long since stopped noticing because it had always been there. A quiet power that didn't announce itself and didn't need to. Behind her, the whispers started. But this time they weren't about her. "That's him. I heard he bought 3 companies last month. He owns half the properties in this city." Ada turned back toward her station. A billionaire. Coming here for dinner. She had learned not to be curious about the guests at Meridian. Curiosity was a luxury she couldn't afford to indulge during a shift. Then she noticed something that made her go still. The woman in red was fixing her hair. The man beside her had straightened in his chair. The whole table that had been openly mocking Ada 60 seconds ago was now rearranging itself, performing a different version of itself for someone whose opinion actually mattered to them. "He's coming this way." Ada looked up. The man was walking directly toward table 4. Each step measured and calm. She moved to give him room to pass. But he didn't pass. He stopped. Right beside her. Close enough that she could feel the stillness of him. The room went completely silent. Ada didn't move. Didn't breathe. The silence had a texture she couldn't read. Why was he standing there? Why had he stopped? She stared at the floor and waited for it to resolve itself. Then he spoke. "Ada." The tray slipped from her hand. The glasses shattered on the marble floor. The sound cut through the silence like something breaking that had been under pressure for a long time. But nobody looked at the glass. Every person in that room was looking at the two of them. Ada's pulse was loud in her ears. She dropped to her knees immediately, reaching for the broken pieces. "Leave it." The voice was calm. Not harsh. Not dismissive. Just absolute. The manager appeared from nowhere, apologizing rapidly, and the man said it again, more quietly, "Leave it." And the manager stopped speaking and stepped back without knowing why he did. Ada slowly stood up. Her hands were trembling slightly. She looked at the man, really looked for the first time, and found something she hadn't expected. He was looking back at her with an expression she couldn't immediately name. Not pity. Not performance. Something more careful than either of those things. Something that looked almost like recognition. "I'm sorry, sir," she said. "I think you might be mistaking me for someone else." A slight pause. "No," he said. "I'm not." A chill moved through her that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. At the table, the woman in red found her voice. "Sir, it's such an honor to have you here. We were just—" "I know what you were doing," he said. He didn't look at her when he said it. His eyes stayed on Ada. But the words landed on the whole table like a change in barometric pressure. I heard everything. No one at that table moved. No one spoke. The man took one small step forward. Not aggressive. Just present. Interesting, he said, almost to himself, how quickly people measure worth based on appearance. The man who had laughed the hardest looked down at his water glass. The woman who had said contaminate it was examining her own hands. We were just joking, one of them managed. Joking, he repeated. Not a question. Just the word, returned to them, so they could hear what it sounded like. Ada stood very still. She was watching this happen and could not entirely make herself believe it was real. Why was he doing this? Why was he standing beside her? Why did he know her name? And then he said the thing that changed the entire room. She wasn't beneath you. The pause. She was ahead of you. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Ada had ever heard. She saw the confusion move across the faces at the table, and she felt it in herself too. What did that mean? How could she be ahead of anyone in this room? She was the one in the faded uniform. She was the one they had been laughing at 10 minutes ago. The woman in red gave a small, nervous laugh. I'm sure you're mistaken, sir. She's just a... He looked at her. Just looked. And whatever she saw in that look was enough to stop her sentence completely and replace it with silence. Careful, he said. Quietly. One word. And it was enough. Then he turned back to Ada, and his voice changed. The authority was still there, but something else came through it. Something more private. Ada, he said. Look at me properly. Something about the way he said it moved through her like a current. It wasn't a command. It was something older than that. And so she did. She looked at him. She let herself really see his face, the sharp jaw, the steady eyes, the composure that had clearly been built over years of becoming something, and she felt her mind begin to reach for something just beyond its grasp. A memory, or the outline of one. A younger version of this face. Different circumstances. A completely different world. She felt it coming before she understood it, the way you sometimes feel a word that won't quite form, standing in the rain. A young man, drenched, shivering. Standing somewhere in the street, invisible to everyone walking past him. Everyone except her. The memory arrived whole, like a photograph developing in real time. She had been younger, still learning how to survive her own life, coming home from a long shift on a cold, wet night when she had barely enough for herself. And there he was. Standing alone in the rain outside a shop she used to pass on the way to the bus stop. People walked past him without slowing down. His eyes had the particular emptiness of someone who had been invisible for long enough to half believe it. She had stopped. She didn't know why she stopped, it wasn't something she planned. She just stopped. Are you okay? He had looked at her like the question itself surprised him. I haven't eaten in 2 days. Ada had reached into her bag. She had almost nothing. A few bills she had been holding back for the end of the week, the kind of money you count carefully because it has to stretch. She took it out and held it toward him. It's not much, she said, but it should help. He stared at the money, then at her. Why are you helping me? She smiled. A simple thing. Because you need it. No conditions. No expectations. No performance of generosity. Just a person seeing another person and acting accordingly. She had forgotten it almost entirely. Not because it hadn't mattered to her, but because she had done it the way she did most things in those years, quietly, without ceremony, and then moved on to the next thing her life required. She had never seen him again. Until now. No, she whispered. Her hand rose slowly to her mouth. No, that's not possible. He was watching her, waiting, patient and still. She said. Her voice came out barely above a sound. You're... Yes, he said. The room leaned in without realizing it was leaning. How? Ada asked. How is this possible? A faint smile crossed his face. Not proud, not performative, just quietly reflective. After that night, he began, everything changed. He glanced around the room once, at the guests, the staff, the manager who had stopped pretending not to listen, and then his eyes came back to her. The money you gave me wasn't just money. He paused. It was the first time in a long time that someone saw me as a person. Ada's eyes were filling. She couldn't stop it. I was at my lowest, he continued, his voice steady and even, each word chosen carefully. No job. No support. No direction. People had already decided what I was worth. He looked at her directly. But you hadn't. The dining room was completely still. The waiters had stopped moving. Even the background music seemed to have faded. No one in the room was pretending to be somewhere else. I used that money to take one small step, he said. Then another. Then another. The pause. I worked. I failed. I tried again. His voice didn't rise or dramatize itself. It was just true, and the truth of it filled the room without needing volume. And eventually, things started to change. He didn't name his companies or list his achievements. He didn't need to. Every person in that restaurant understood the distance between a young man starving in the rain and the person standing in front of them, and the understanding of that distance was doing its own work. But through all of it, he said softly, I never forgot that night. Ada's hand pressed harder against her mouth. Tears were streaming freely now, and she wasn't trying to stop them. You probably don't even remember it the way I do, he said. No, she said immediately, shaking her head. I remember. Her voice broke on the last word. I never thought it mattered that much. He looked at her for a moment. It mattered more than you think. A deep silence followed, not the uncomfortable kind, but the kind that happens when something real has been said in a room full of people who weren't expecting realness. Then he turned. Slowly. Deliberately. Back toward the table. The woman in red was staring at her lap. The man who had laughed the loudest was studying the tablecloth. No one at that table could look either of them in the eye. The people who had constructed the most elaborate performance of superiority Ada had witnessed in 3 years of working at this restaurant now sat in the wreckage of it, unable to find a single useful thing to say. You said something earlier, the man began. His voice was calm. No heat in it. Something almost worse than heat, certainty. No one answered. You said she didn't belong here. He took one step closer to the table. Not aggressive. Not loud. Just close enough that the distance between his words and their hearing of them was gone. Let me ask you something. Silence. What exactly makes someone worthy of respect? He let the question sit. No one attempted an answer. Money? Nothing. Clothes? Nothing. Status? Still nothing. He tilted his head slightly. Because if that's your standard, you've completely misunderstood what life is. The words didn't come in at volume. They came in at weight. I stood where she stands, he said. I know what it feels like to be invisible. To be judged before you open your mouth. To be dismissed by people who haven't spent 30 seconds thinking about what it cost you to get to where you are. He looked back at Ada briefly, a glance that carried in it something Ada couldn't entirely name, something between recognition and gratitude and grief for the version of both of them that had existed that rainy night years ago. She showed more humanity in one moment, he said, than most people show in a lifetime. No one at the table could look at Ada the way they had been looking at her an hour ago. That version of her, the one they had constructed to explain their laughter and justify their contempt, had been quietly dismantled while they watched, and they all knew it. The woman in red finally spoke. Her voice had lost everything that had been in it before. We didn't know. That's the problem, he said immediately. You didn't try to know. The silence that followed was the specific silence of people who have just seen themselves clearly and do not particularly like what they're seeing. Ada stood in the middle of all of it, still trying to reassemble the pieces of the last 20 minutes into something coherent. The room that had made her feel small. The man who had appeared from nowhere. The memory that had surfaced like something that had been waiting in deep water for exactly this moment. She felt unmoored in the best possible way. Like something had shifted in the architecture of the evening and she hadn't yet learned how to stand in the new configuration. Then something unexpected happened. The man reached into his pocket and took out his phone. Made a call. The whole room watched. Yes, he said simply. I'm at the restaurant. The pause. I've seen enough. The manager stepped forward, his voice suddenly smaller than it had been all evening. Sir, please, there's no need to. The man ended the call. He looked at the manager with an expression that was not unkind but was entirely without softness. "I just finalized something I've been considering for a while," he said. A pause that the whole room fell into. "I bought this place." The sound that went through the dining room then was unlike anything Ada had heard in 3 years of working there: gasps, scattered voices, chairs shifting, the collective intake of breath that happens when a room's understanding of itself is suddenly and completely revised. The manager went very still. "Sir, you mean you own?" "Yes." Simple, final, unambiguous. The woman in red looked like the floor had moved beneath her chair. I didn't know," she stammered. The man didn't respond to her. He turned to Ada, and when his expression changed, when the composed authority gave way to something quieter and more human, Ada felt the shift in her chest like a change in pressure. "Ada." She looked up at him. "You once helped someone when you had nothing." Her throat tightened. "You didn't ask questions. You didn't judge. You didn't calculate what you could afford to give versus what you needed to keep." He looked at her steadily. "You just helped." The tears came again, and this time she didn't try to manage them. "Today I have more than enough," he said. "So I want to ask you something." The room leaned forward without moving. "Would you be willing to run this place?" The silence that followed was total. Complete. Even the candles seemed to hold still. Ada blinked. Then blinked again. What? "I want you to manage it," he said. "As general manager. I want you running this restaurant." Her hands were trembling. "I can't. I'm just a waitress. I don't know how to." "You're someone who understands people," he said, simply and without any performance around it. "Someone who can tell the difference between a guest who needs warmth and a guest who needs space, who knows when something is wrong before it escalates, who works with care even when no one is watching and no one is grateful. That's rarer than any business qualification I could ask for." The pause. "And that's more valuable than most things I pay for." "But I've never managed a business," she said, her voice unsteady. "You'll learn. And I'll make sure you have everything you need." Ada stood in that room, the same room where she had been mocked an hour ago, in the same uniform, with the same rough hands and the same faded shoes, and felt the entire weight of the moment settle on her at once. This was not just a job offer. This was not just an act of gratitude. This was a door opening at the end of 3 years of keeping her head down and her face still and her voice quiet, and someone standing on the other side of it saying, "You were always worth this." She looked around the room. At the table where the woman in red was looking at her hands. At the man who had laughed loudest, now studying the tablecloth with great concentration. At the staff who had stopped pretending to work. At the manager whose apologies were arriving too late and too quietly to mean much. At all of it, the whole room that had been the site of her humiliation 40 minutes ago, now transformed into something else entirely. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely holding. "Why are you doing this?" He smiled then. Not wide, not performed. Just real. "Because you did it for me when it mattered most." Ada closed her eyes briefly. Let the tears fall without stopping them. Felt 3 years of carrying herself quietly through rooms that didn't see her do something she hadn't expected. Not release exactly, but a kind of settling. A recognition. As if some weight she had stopped noticing had been set down somewhere nearby and she could finally feel the difference. She opened her eyes. She nodded. "Yes," she said. Softly. But without any uncertainty in it. "Yes. I'll do it." The room responded, not with laughter this time, but with a different kind of collective intake of breath. The kind that means everyone present understands they are watching something that will matter to them later, something they will tell other people about, something that will sit differently in the memory than the ordinary moments on either side of it. The woman in red stood up. "I'm so sorry, Ada. I didn't mean." Ada looked at her. Grounded in a way she hadn't been all evening. "It's okay," she said. "But next time," she paused, not with anger, but with the simple authority of someone who has earned the right to say the next thing clearly, "Be kind to people even when you don't know their story." The woman lowered her head. It was the only appropriate response. The man turned to leave. He had done what he came to do, or perhaps what he had not planned to do but had found himself doing the moment he walked through that door and recognized, standing in the middle of a room full of people who couldn't see her, the woman who had once seen him. He paused at the edge of the room and looked back one last time. "You changed my life once," he said. A small smile. "Now it's my turn." And he walked out. The restaurant held its silence for a long time after he left. Not the uncomfortable silence of people who don't know what to say, but the quieter silence of people who are rearranging something in their understanding. The candles burned. The music played softly. The kitchen sounds resumed eventually, one at a time, like an orchestra finding its way back after an unplanned pause. Ada stood where she was for another moment. Chinedu appeared at her elbow from the kitchen, his eyes wide. She looked at him and he looked at her, and neither of them said anything. There was nothing to say yet. The night was still too new around them. She looked at the broken glasses on the floor, still there, where she had dropped them, where the man had told everyone to leave them. Then she walked to the kitchen, found the dustpan and brush, and came back and cleaned them up herself. Because that was who she was. And that had always been enough. It had just taken the right moment for the rest of the room to see it. In the weeks that followed, Ada took on the responsibility of general manager the way she had always taken on difficult things, methodically, carefully, learning as she went, asking questions without embarrassment, making mistakes and correcting them without drama. The man who had given her the role was true to his word. He made sure she had access to training, mentorship, financial education, everything she needed to grow into what he had seen in her before she could see it in herself. The restaurant changed under her management in ways that weren't immediately visible but that everyone felt. The staff worked differently when they knew they were seen. Guests were treated with consistent warmth regardless of what they wore or how they arrived. Small things were noticed and addressed before they became large ones. People came back not just for the food, which was excellent, but for the quality of the experience, which had become something that could not be easily replicated because it came from a specific understanding, the understanding of someone who had served and been dismissed and had nevertheless maintained her sense of what other people deserved. Ada thought sometimes about the woman in red, about the man who had laughed the loudest, about the manager who had let it all happen and apologized only when consequences arrived. She didn't spend much time being angry at any of them. Anger was expensive and she had better uses for her energy. She thought more often about a rainy night years ago, about a young man shivering in the street, about the moment she had reached into her bag without calculating whether she could afford to. She had thought it was just a small thing. The smallest kind of thing. A few bills, a moment's attention, nothing that would last. It had lasted. It had lasted years and traveled across all the distance between that street corner and this room, and arrived here in the form of a door that had swung open when she least expected it. She thought about what that meant. Not in any grand or self-congratulatory way, she was not given to grandiosity. But quietly in the pauses of the working day, she thought about it. About how kindness moves through the world in ways you cannot track or predict or plan for. About how the moment of it, the choosing of it when you have almost nothing, is the moment that plants something in another person that you may never see grow. You cannot control whether it grows. You cannot control when or how it comes back. You can only control the choosing. She had chosen without knowing what it would cost her or what it would return. That was the whole of it. That was enough. If this story stayed with you, if you have ever done something kind without expecting anything in return, and wondered afterward whether it mattered, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Because what Ada did on that rainy night years ago was not remarkable by any measure she would have applied to it. It was a small act, done quietly, in the middle of her own difficult life, for a stranger who needed it. But small acts do not stay small. They travel. They compound. They arrive, sometimes years later, in forms you never imagined, as doors you did not know you had opened. Be kind when it costs you something. That is when it counts most. And you may never know how far it goes.